Hey guys, this is Khavrion here with another battle report. This is going to be for round 2 of IGL Season 7 America Edition. It will be me as Steel Phalanx against the aptly named Monkeybizniz as Morat Aggression Forces on the IGL custom mission Sensor Field by Inane Imp. As with the battle report for the previous round of IGL Season 7, this game ends up being something of a blowout for me, which means that all the caveats and concerns about battle reports about blowout games from the previous video also apply to this one. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. As mentioned earlier, the mission is Sensor Field, which is a custom mission by Inane Imp. And I actually gave Inane Imp a lot of, I'm not going to say feedback, I'm going to say these were hot takes about earlier drafts of this mission. They then went and took all the feedback from people like me, but also from people who are actually, playtesting the mission and actually giving much more in-depth thoughts than I was giving. They took all that feedback and reworked it in order to give you the mission that you see here. I really liked the changes that they made, and in general, I would love to do a really thorough battle report that focuses on this mission specifically. However, this particular battle report boiled down a lot more to killing than to the mission specifically, so I don't think this is the battle report to actually review Sensor Field all that thoroughly. I will thus describe the mission at a high level without spending too much time on the details or the strategy. In essence, Sensor Field is quadrant control with a twist. And the twist is that instead of controlling zones with troopers, you control them with multi-scanners. Multi-scanners are a piece of equipment that specialists can put down with a whip roll. And if you have a multi-scanner in that quadrant at the end of a game round, then you are counted as having scanned that quadrant. Importantly, scanning a quadrant has nothing to do with your opponent's multi-scanners. If they have multi-scanners in a quadrant and so do you, then you both scan the quadrant. The only way to steal a quadrant from a multi-scanner perspective from your opponent is by killing all the multi-scanners that they have put down. Killing multi-scanners is harder and more interactive than simply moving in a giant sack of points like you might have to do in normal quadrant control, which means that I'm fairly optimistic about Sensor Field being an improvement over the famously second turn favoring ITS mission quadrant control. That said, the primary focus of this battle report and of the battle was mostly on killing, so I won't really dwell on Sensor Field too much longer. Next up, we'll talk about lists. I am once again running the perhaps incorrectly named Why Not Have a GML Bot in Group 2. This is one of the many Big Boys inspired lists that folks came up with in the main Discord after the Steel Phalanx rework, and I am playing it mostly because it was the list that I had the most confidence and experience with when I had to submit my lists for IGL Season 7. That said, the list has done great, so I don't feel bad about bringing it. This is essentially a 2 Enomatarkos Big Boy list. The first Enomatarkos is strongly inspired by the original Big Boy Enomatarkos. You have Ajax, Machaon, Phoenix, and a Myrmidon. Ajax, Phoenix, and Machaon are all fantastic, and together they are really, really strong. The traditional fourth member of this Enomatarkos is actually Akmon, but I have put him in the second link and chosen to put a Myrmidon in the first link so that Phoenix can be pure. Purity isn't that big of a deal, but considering that Akmon wants to be in the other link anyway, getting Phoenix a BS-14 for his heavy rocket launcher in ARO is well worth the effort. Speaking of the other Enomatarkos, it is Oideros, who is a Myrmidon Spitfire hero. He has 2 structure rather than wounds. He has Eclipse Grenades, he has a Mark 12, and he's got BS-13. Akmon is the Tactical Awareness 2-wound engineer that we've come to really appreciate in traditional Big Boys. And I round this out with a Myrmidon Officer, Chain of Command, and Pandora. The Myrmidon Officer, frankly, is not that interesting. It feels kind of like you made a hero profile out of the worst of the Myrmidon options. I mean, poor fella only has an AP CCW for crying out loud. But the dude is 1 wound NWI, the dude has Eclipse Grenades, and most importantly, the dude is a Chain of Command. If I am deviating from the traditional Big Boys format, it is because I am worried about my opponent parking a pitcher right next to Hector, and then either isolating or guided missile striking him. And in that context, the Chain of Command means that if I do lose Machaon, who is an obvious lieutenant, I'm not going to be in loss of lieutenant. After that is Pandora. She was the most interesting addition to Steel Phalanx with the rework. I mean, she really was basically taking Thamiris, changing him up a little bit, and then making him a wild card. But that wildcard status is absolutely fascinating. Of course, in practice, the things that I am most excited about with her are the ability to take all of my repeaters and give them teeth. These two Lameds and this Probot, and of course her own pitchers, all now have the threat of oblivioning anything that comes through and which is hackable and which is not a Morat. That won't matter too much since I am in fact up against Morats, but it is nevertheless the thing I'm most excited about. The only other thing that I want to talk about is this Samek missile launcher. Theoretically, the idea is that Oideros and his team can move up, Pandora can throw pitchers next to important things, and then the lot of them can move Spotlight, thereby gaining extra efficiency out of what is otherwise a rather fraught Burst 1 versus Burst 1 Spotlight attempt. In practice, I've never actually tried that with any success. Every time I see an opportunity that looks perfect for the guided missile steel phalanx thing, I basically chicken out at the last second and then don't bother. There might be an overall lesson there. It might be that you just have to get too close with Pandora before you can start throwing pitchers, and by that point you don't really want to move in Spotlight. I don't know. But at the very least, the idea is that I've got the missile launcher in the list, and maybe I'll actually use it someday. So yeah, that's my list. Next up, let's go over my opponent's list. As with so many of these battle reports, I don't exactly remember what my opponent brought. However, I do think that this particular list construction was one of the things that gave me an advantage at the game right out of the gate. In particular, while my opponent did have 3 link teams, I did not feel like any one of these link teams was actually all that threatening to me. The first and most important link team, in my opinion, was this Harris of the Kaitok, Suryat, and Anyat. Now, of course, all 3 of these are wonderful pieces. The Kaitok is practically steel phalanx tier in terms of being tough. The Suryat is one of the few 2-wound MSV arrow pieces with a decent price and a decent arrow weapon. And Anyat is a linkable K1 combi rifle with smoke, EM grenades, and a chain colt. All 3 of these guys feel really close to auto-include in almost every single Morat force. And in that sense, I do not begrudge their inclusion in this list. However, I don't love this Harris. The problem is, I don't think this Harris has any active turn teeth. The Kaitok with his Flaming Spear and Armor 5 is, yes, excellent in arrow. The Suryat with his heavy rocket launcher and MSV-1, in addition to being an arrow piece, can take some pot shots at targets, especially warbands. But if you actually use Anyat Smoke to end up getting close with this link, you're really reduced to just taking pot shots with Anyat's K1 combi rifle. That's not an awful weapon, but it's only BS-12. And it's really easy to imagine spending a lot of orders, smoking your way up with Anyat, only to then spend a whole bunch of orders failing to deal a crippling blow to your opponent. This becomes especially true in the matchup against Steel Phalanx. None of these 3 are particularly threatening to me. Anyat and the Kaitok are both crippled by the multiple wounds and mimetism that my troopers have, and the low burst of the Suryat means that he doesn't want to go face-to-face with someone like Phoenix, who's giving him a -3 because he only has MSV-1. So, on the attack, the most dangerous thing this thing can do is have a literal rocket tag between the Suryat and Phoenix, and I don't find that scary. The next link in the list that I'll talk about are the Yaugat, Kurgat, and Morat. Of those 3, I don't think it's much of a hot take to say that the Yaugat is the all-star. This guy is an MSV-2 multi-sniper with +1 burst, which essentially means that he's going to have a burst 4, damage 15, double action MSV-2 gun. He's only BS-12, and he's only 1 wound, and he's not even shock immune. So there is some risk that if he loses the face-to-face, he's going to be eating dirt really fast. But as the Steel Phalanx player, I can't count on getting lucky and winning a face-to-face. As such, the Yaugat is very much the gun that I need to avoid in order to keep my head down. The problem is, my opponent has put the Yaugat in Group 2 and paired him with 2 troopers that don't really want to advance into the midfield. Therefore, while it might be possible that my opponent uses all of his Group 2 orders to draw a bead on Phoenix specifically with that multi-sniper rifle, he simply isn't going to be able to use this link team to exploit the gap and get close and do lots of damage. What I'm going to end up doing is putting Phoenix down in exactly the right position that the Yaugat can't see him without spending a lot of orders, but which Phoenix will still have a perfectly commanding arrow potential. The final link, which unfortunately I have not put together, is an Osnat and 4 Gakis. Now, with the fireteam change, there was a rule added that these Gakis become regular orders if they're in a core with an Osnet. And a lot of people got really, really excited by this rule. They observed, as I think I had observed in the Discord at various points in time, that Morats are really expensive. So having 4 really cheap orders paired with an Osnet that's also not too expensive is a really exciting thing. And I basically agree that, yeah, that is exciting. The problem in this list specifically, and also in Morats in general, is that forming this link costs you your fireteam core. And Morats have really, really good fireteam core options. For those of you not in the know, Morats basically get to ignore the section of the fireteam rules that talks about purity. Almost all the Morat units that you'd like to put in your fireteam core count as Morat Vanguard Infantry, and thus pretty much every fireteam core of Morats is going to count as pure. So when you form a fireteam core of an Osnet and a bunch of Gakis, what you're doing is giving up +3 ballistic skill on troopers like the Yaugat with his fantastic multi-sniper rifle, or the Suryat heavy rocket launcher with his great ARO potential, or the Suryat HMG, which doesn't feature in this list, but which is tactical aware and is a BS-13 HMG. And generally speaking, I think that that loss really hurts your average Morat Aggression Forces list. Morats need to shoot enemy ARO pieces that have MSV in order to solve problems, and losing the fireteam core costs you one of the best tools for that shooting. And I think it hurts this list even harder in particular. As we've already discussed, I don't love the close-range damage dealing potential of either of the other 2 Harrises. They both have some long-range ARO potential, they both have some long-range firepower potential, but you need to therefore use your core in order to exploit the gaps created by the Yaugat, get in there, and deal damage with something that's close range. Sadly, that's not something this core can do. Sure, the Gakis are cheap cheerleaders, but because they consume your fireteam core slot, they are consuming the very thing in Morats that would love to have the orders that they generate. And against Steel Phalanx, these things really are going to do nothing more than sit there and cheerlead as the rest of their army tries to do the work. With the fireteams discussed, I will now go on to talk about the soloists. Actually, I'll first remark that it is raining here, so I apologize if my microphone is picking that up. And speaking of the rain that's happening in my real life, let's talk about the Razyat, who is another trooper that drops from the sky. This dude made quite a splash when N4 first hit, and we all saw that he got parachutist deployment zone. Everyone was really worried that this guy would show up on the edge of your deployment zone, use Eclipse grenades to advance into CC with whoever you wanted to kill, and then use martial arts and natural born warrior to absolutely annihilate the target. If not annihilating things in CC, people then thought that he was going to use his BS-12 Spitfire to take some pot shots and generally win the game. Unfortunately for the Razyat, and really all drop troopers, it didn't take long for people to realize that the Tactical Window 15 model cap made it very easy to spot drop troops. Basically, as soon as the order count phase happened, and often beforehand, you could tell exactly how many gaps your opponent had, and if they, had gaps, you could then take care to watch your own deployment zone. Some factions, like Vanilla Combined Army, could make it a little harder to guess what's going on here because a Noctifer could be in a gap or a Razyat could be in that gap. But against Morats, when I'm seeing a 1.5 SWC gap and I'm seeing a trooper not on the board, then I can be pretty darn sure that a Razyat is coming. And with that certainty, I can take special care to make sure that every inch of the edge of my deployment zone is being watched. This significantly hampers the Razyat's ability to get work done. That being said, even if I had missed a gap or a spot or something like that, he's not that dangerous against Steel Phalanx in particular. The problem is, he's only BS-12 with a Spitfire, so maybe he flanks me and maybe he draws a bead on Phoenix, for example. Well, he's still getting -6 from my mimetism, and I'm still able to throw Burst 2 Smoke, which will then completely shut him down. Yes, it is possible that he could then run up and stab me with his martial arts, but he's only movement 4/4, he's only CC 21, and because he, has to deal with my Sixth Sense, I might be able to dodge out of that smoke and then template him as he gets closer. Even under ideal circumstances, the Razyat is not that threatening to Steel Phalanx, and with proper deployment and care, I can make it so he's not going to be getting those ideal circumstances. The same is true of the next soloist that I'm going to discuss, which is the Rindak. The Rendak is sort of like a crusher for Morats. Forward deployment plus 8 inches. I think he's got 1 structure and NWI. And he has the especially annoying trifecta of dodge plus 3, dodge minus 3, dodge plus 1 inch. What that means is that if this guy dodges, he's doing so on a 16, he can move an extra inch if he succeeds, and he's giving you a minus 3 if there is a face-to-face involved. This has a lot of potential to be exceedingly annoying, but against Steel Phalanx, it's not actually going to be all that dangerous. Ultimately, again, he is simply a BS-12 medium to short-range gun with relatively low damage and relatively low burst. I can't actually remember if he took the SMG profile or the multi-rifle plus 1 burst profile, but either way, you're talking about a trooper that is not fundamentally all that damaging. Next soloist is the Morat Killer Hacker. Not much to say about the Morat. It is an infiltrator that doesn't have marker state on deployment. Being a killer hacker, you can spend orders in order to go into marker state, but at 27 points, I'm not sure I find it all that interesting. Now, in this particular mission, infiltrating specialists are nice. This is especially true if you go first, because you can infiltrate a specialist right next to the opponent's quadrant and then walk across the quadrant line and plank a sensor field thingy down immediately for 1 point. But in general, I feel like the Morats, like pretty much all of the infiltrators without marker state that aren't Morans, are simply not that interesting. Our last soloist to discuss is the Dodarazi. Now, Dodarazi really are fantastic. They are the warbands that everyone, kinda including Steel Phalanx, wishes that they have. As warbands, they are smoke-throwing, impetuous berserkers with a lot of CC skill. They have mimetism, which is just a little bit extra annoying. And unlike things like Morlocks, they are actually regular. That entire package clocks in at 14 points, which is 2 points less than Steel Phalanx's version, the Myrmidon. It is kind of expensive just for generating an order, but they are well worth the cost. Dodarazi really are fantastic. And in Morats, you actually can link the Dodarazi. Linking the Dodarazi cancels their impetuous, which means that they can take cover and also can give them burst 2 on their smoke grenades. Like, seriously, if I were playing Morat aggression forces, one of the big reasons would be so that I can take linked Dodarazi. Thus, in that context, I am a little bit disappointed to see him just as a soloist. Still, he is, really fantastic, and so I have absolutely no shame in including him. And yeah, that is approximately my opponent's list. To summarize, there's a lot of good pieces that are in here. The Kaitak is great, Anyat is great, the Yaugat is great. However, in the specific matchup against Steel Phalanx, I feel like this list is really lacking in medium to short range dangerous guns. And the ones that are there, like the Group 2 Yaugat, like the Suryat, I'm fairly confident that I can outmaneuver and play around. Next up, deployment. My opponent won the die roll and decided to go first. Now, you might think that the mission sensor field favors going second, and I might agree with you if you said that. But just in general in infiNity, it feels like getting to go first means you get to act first, and getting to act first gives you that advantage of not losing the game before you can even try to do anything. As a consequence, I, and I think many other infiNity players, are strongly tempted to go first if you win the lieutenant role, and this game is no exception. I therefore chose deployment, and I have to say, both of these deployment zones are really, really open. The map itself, I think, is a little bit Swiss cheese. There's a lot of long, small fire lanes, but the deployment zones themselves are just these giant stretches of nothing. Like, if you get a trooper up to this position, then he can see, like, all the way down over to there, all the way down over to there, and then, you can move over to this position and see behind this box. There simply is not a lot of reliable cover in the deployment zones themselves. And this deployment zone seems pretty open, but the other side is even worse. For this reason, I was not too unhappy to actually get the choice of choosing which deployment zone that I wanted. And it's my understanding that this was actually part of the IGL's design goals for this map. They wanted to prevent people from just winning the die roll and then going straight to second, and they did so by making it so that, choosing which deployment zone you had was something that mattered. At least, I think that's what they did. Anyway, I knew that I needed to prevent my opponent from being able to run up here and then shoot my guys from this position, and so the way that I did that is by having one Enomatarkos over here, I had Uteros there, the Myrmidon officer there, Pandora's there, and Akmon is there. On the other side, I then had Machaon in this position. He's trying to be as safe as possible. A Myrmidon there. Ajax is there. This is a Warcore. And then I tried to stuff everyone else as safe as they could be. I had a Lamed there, and a Lamed there, and a Probot there. I was hoping this would give me good coverage on repeaters, and then the Samic missile launcher was there. I hope you're also noticing that I'm taking very special care to watch the entirety of my deployment edge. Remember, my opponent has to deploy first, so at that point, I'm fairly concerned about a Raziat showing up. My withheld piece was Phoenix, but when I set out the team, I was pretty sure that I was going to be putting him in that position, and lo and behold, that is exactly what I did. Here is my opponent's deployment. For Group 2, I believe the Yaugat is on the other side of this crate. This is the Morat, and this is the Vanguard. There is then a Zerat here, the Rindak here, I believe that was his withheld trooper. The solo Dadarazi is in this position. The Gaki core is set up over like this. I believe there are 2 Gakis downstairs, which then leaves the other Harris. This is the Suryat heavy rocket launcher. This is the Kaitok. And then Anyat is, I think, downstairs behind these cars, although I'm not entirely sure. If it looks like we're missing some prone markers, I think that's correct. I think I took this picture before all of them were down. But even without the prone markers, there's a lot that I do want to talk about this deployment. Unfortunately, I think my opponent has left himself really, really exposed, which gives me a quite big advantage. The most obvious example of that exposure is that the Dadarazi, Suryat, and Kaitok are all exposed through this fire lane back to my deployment zone. If we switch over to this picture, we can see that what is through that deployment zone is none other than Phoenix, my chief aero guy himself. Worse, because the Dadarazi is actually visible by Phoenix, my opponent doesn't have any way to activate the Dadarazi to run forward impetuously and throw smoke without risking me being able to splash the Dadarazi and the Kaitok. Now, Phoenix was my withheld piece, so my opponent in principle didn't know what was going to be put down afterwards. But there is nevertheless a very important lesson that I want to convey just right off the bat from this deployment. And that lesson is be exceedingly careful about what you deploy that is visible to your opponent's deployment zone. If you put down a trooper and it has line of fire into your opponent's deployment zone, then they can and probably will put down their own trooper in order to watch that guy. There are a number of ways that a mean or canny opponent could punish you for deploying troopers in line of fire of the enemy deployment zone. They could put down 2 or even 3 aero pieces watching one guy. They could, as I have done, put down a template ready to splash if someone activates. Or they could simply put 1 aero piece down, choosing a really long fire lane that gives them the advantage. So the lesson is, really don't put troopers down that are going to have line of fire to your opponent's deployment zone unless you're going to be really, really careful. That being said, to give my opponent, some credit, as we're seeing here, this deployment zone is really quite open. And I suspect that my opponent wanted to be able to either advance with these guys or use them on aero. If you're not planning on activating the Suryat or the Kaitok, putting them in this position isn't all that bad in my opinion, because they really do have some commanding lines of fire. The Suryat can see this way, the Suryat can see this way, and basically everywhere that the Suryat can see, the Kaitok can also see. Even though my opponent was going first, it's not hard to imagine that these troopers were going to be an ARO threat, and being an ARO threat, it's not a bad idea to get them in position at deployment where they're going to be. Lord knows I lost my game against Lobo in Season 6 because I could not decide whether I wanted to deploy my troopers defensively or aggressively, and here my opponent has chosen to deploy his troopers with ARO in mind. But that deployment does mean that they are rather thoroughly pinned, and I think that's going to be a pretty significant loss. The next thing to comment is that a lot of these troopers are rather exposed from this particular angle. What's going to happen on my turn too is I'm going to get Oiteros over here, and I'm going to be able to draw a line of fire underneath this crate in order to see a whole lot of guys. I will see this Gaki. This Osnat's prone, so I won't see that, but there's another Gaki downstairs that I'll be able to see. I'll be able to see Treytak, who, like I said, I think is hiding behind these cars. I actually ultimately am able to find a long-range line of fire on this Morat off in the distance. I think it's like this line of fire. And so as a result, I am able to just rocket up this flank and then use Oiteros to just move, shoot, and move, kill a whole lot of orders on my turn. So the second lesson, the second thing that is important to keep in mind is when you're thinking about how exposed your troopers are, it's important not just to look at your opponent's deployment zone. Remember, my deployment zone was, over here or something like that. But also look at where in the midfield or where on your own flanks the good lines of fire on your troopers are going to be. That being said, my opponent's deployment zone absolutely sucked. These boxes being angled the way that they were provide cover from only one angle at any given time, and the precious handful of other spots that provide multi-angle protection, like over here and over here, are so distant that there isn't really a good spot to actually deploy a fire team. My opponent consumed basically all the good hidey holes with his Gakis and his Osnat, which I think was the right thing to do, and even then was left with a lot of troopers that were really, really, really exposed. Thus, I think the openness and the design of this deployment zone is a big factor in why my opponent ended up being as exposed as he was. I'm not going to say the deployment zone is necessarily poor quality. I think that the map designers had this mission in mind and were very intentional about making it so that choice of deployment zone mattered. But I do feel like this deployment zone is unusually open. So much so that I think that if I had to go first on this particular deployment zone, I might have spent a lot of time and energy stressing about getting into the midfield where my troopers would just have a slightly better chance of being safe. And maybe that's a lesson too. If you're going first, you can use your initiative to attack, or you can use it to improve your own defensive position, and that second option might be a good one. That's actually pretty much it in terms of the discussion of deployment. And coupled with the discussions of the list, we could almost stop the battle report there. I'll do a very brief blow-by-blow, but in my opinion, the key factors that will tell you about how this game are going to go have already been outlined. My opponent does not have that many attack pieces that can threaten Steel Phalanx. Those attack pieces that he does have, like the Suryat, are pinned. And then once my opponent has attacked, I am still going to have lots of orders which will allow me to push up myself and then punish his exposed position. Having weathered his storm and punished him right back, I will then be able to snowball that advantage and ultimately win the game. With that summary, I'll go ahead and get started. The first thing that happens is my opponent realizes that his position is really quite pinned here and decides to just go for it with the Dadarazi. The Dadarazi runs up and throws smoke, and Phoenix shoots him. I can't remember if I miss or if he wins the face-to-face or something like that, but the smoke goes down, the Kaitok is perfectly fine, and the Dadarazi is uninjured. Having spent those orders, my opponent then spends a handful of Group 2 orders putting down sensors. I believe this Zerat puts down a sensor here and then goes into marker state. And then there's a Kurgat here that maybe runs out and puts out a sensor. I'm not sure. And finally, this Rindak spends a lot of orders basically just running and dodging to get all the way into this position and put down sensors. It's not a terrible use of orders given the circumstances. He does get 1 point for getting a sensor into this quadrant before I can get any sensors into it. But the turn ends, I have entirely my order pool intact and am ready to go on the offensive. Using this picture to describe it, Orderos really does just rock his way up here. The Rindak ends his turn, I think, at that spot. It takes me a handful of orders to shoot the darn thing, but because Orderos is 6'2", I am able to move, shoot, and make good progress on the advance, even as I am failing to hit this guy with his dodge -3. I don't remember how far the Rindak gets, but he does end up getting smoke thrown onto him, and then I cut his head off with Orderos. In that time, I am also putting down sensors of my own and killing his sensors, so I end up basically getting a sensor here, and I think I get a sensor here. Having done that, I spend all of my remaining orders shooting whatever I feel like. I think I used some Eclipse Smoke in order to block the Suryat, but I kill Traytak, I kill, I think, 2 of the Gakis. I can't remember if I killed the Dadarazi or not. I think I shoot at him and maybe he survives. But I do kill a whole lot of stuff. And when I end, I have a very solid defensive position with my Anomatarkos here. And I have the advantage in sensors being placed, I think. Turn 2, my opponent decides to deploy his Raziat. I had actually missed a spot. The Raziat can walk onto the board exactly right there and no one will see him. Problematically, though, there is a Lamed flashball spot right there, and of course, as he walks on, I can spotlight him. The Lamed passes the dodge and is able to dodge to this position where he can see the Rindak. Sorry, the Raziat, not Rindak. And then in the first face-to-face, the Lamet is able to stun the Raziat, and that's that. With that done, my opponent, whose Zerat is right here, manages to use a combination of Hustling and Marker State to run up here and put down yet more sensors. He is again the first person to get a sensor in this quadrant, which scores another point for my opponent. So things aren't looking too bad when we get to this stage. However, at this juncture, pretty much all of my opponent's firepower has been spent. My order pool is entirely intact, and it's just a mop-up operation after that. This is what things look like at the end of my second turn. As you can see, I have killed the Suryat, I've killed the Kaitok. There's almost none of the Gakis are left, and the Raziat over there has also been taken out. So a lot of damage has been done. You'll also notice that I managed to move my guys up into what may at face value seem to be a dumb position. What this picture doesn't show is that I have drawn the Rescue Classified, which is worth 2 points if I can rescue someone close to my opponent's deployment zone. So my hope is that I will put these guys on arrow in this position, and that my opponent will take the bait and shoot at someone and knock someone unconscious so that I can then rescue them. Now, it's true that a lot of these guys have 1 wound NWI, but to my understanding, NWI is actually an optional skill. So if Phoenix takes a wound, I can elect not to use NWI, he will fall unconscious, and I can then rescue him. It's cheeky, and it really serves basically no function whatsoever except to score those extra points from rescue. But when you get given rescue as your card, you try to get the extra points from it. Also worth noting at this stage, I haven't killed that many of my opponent's sensors, nor have I scored all that many points for getting sensors into my opponent's quadrants while he has nothing. So at the end of my turn 2, it does look like the score is 4 points to my opponent and 3 points to me, but that is a misleading picture because of just how much damage I've done to my opponent's army. His turn 3 starts looking something like this. He's actually in loss of lieutenant because I've killed his Morat lieutenant, but because everyone's veteran, he's thinking, I'm okay with that. He decides he wants to go for the moral victory and kill Ajax, and I believe that that is exactly what the Yaugat does. I think the Yaugat manages to kill Phoenix outright, which is a shame because no rescue, manages to kill Ajax outright, which is a shame because no rescue, and then basically accomplishes nothing else. Actually, I think I got something wrong there because I did score rescue. I don't really remember. But the point is that, at this point, it's pretty much over. I am able to kill pretty much every sensor left on the field. I am able to score my points for these quadrants and this quadrant, and I'm able to get the 2 points for having more quadrants than my opponent, and that's pretty much that. As I said, I think this game was largely decided in 3 places. The first place was in list creation and matchup. My opponent simply did not have the medium to short range guns that were dangerous enough to actually hurt my order pool and hurt my game plan. Next, I think the game was decided by deployment. My opponent positioned himself in such a fashion that a lot of his troopers were still exposed at deployment, and this led to them being pinned down during that initial effective first assault. Finally, the game was decided, again in a sense because of deployment, but largely by how exposed a lot of my opponent's cheerleaders were to the attack along this flank. As a bitter lesson that I myself have learned, it's really important when you're going first to think about what your troopers are going to look like when your opponent's first turn rolls around. That pretty much wraps up this battle report. I hope it was interesting to you, and even if it wasn't, thanks for watching, and I will catch you around.